A winter warehouse is supposed to do almost nothing, and that is exactly why your work is difficult. Ships have carried their noise away from Lubeck, yet the cargo they left behind still has to reach spring in the same condition, under the same owner's mark, and in the same place. Let the room around you grow dim, settle where you are comfortable, and come into a tall merchant house in the late 15th century. You are the clerk trusted with its stores. Above you are sacks, barrels, bales, and grain. Below you are wax, furs, drink, and pitch. Your ordinary problem is simple to say and tedious to achieve. Nothing spoils, nothing wanders, and nothing becomes someone else's property by mistake. The street door shuts behind you with a wooden weight that makes the house feel taller. The ground floor, the diele, rises several meters above your head. It is not merely an entrance hall. It is where a merchant household cooks, eats, writes, receives people, and moves goods before they travel higher or lower through the building. Apprentices and journeymen may sleep in this working space or in the story above. The merchant's home is also a machine for holding trade. You begin where winter work always begins, not with the most valuable object, but with the route through the house. A passage must remain open beneath the hoist. A sack that blocks a floor opening is not only inconvenient, it can stop the next barrel from being lowered safely. You walk the diele, look upward through the closable openings in the floors, and make sure nothing has been left where a rope must run. The great warehouse seems motionless, but its stillness has a geometry. Every object has to leave room for the next object to move. There is a modest satisfaction in discovering that yesterday's careful stacking remains careful today. Medieval commerce has already invented the pleasure of finding that nobody improved your system overnight. The brick shell helps distinguish this merchant house from the older wooden buildings that once dominated more of the city. But brick does not make the contents self-managing. The tall working floor still has to accommodate family life, employees, writing, cooking, and the passage of heavy freight. Every route through it is shared. You take the first inventory upward. An internal rope hoist serves the floors of this kind of merchant house. Its wheel is under the roof, with rope running down through the building, so heavy goods can be raised and lowered through openings in the floors rather than dragged stair by stair. The arrangement makes the house feel connected by a single vertical line. On the first upper story stand barrels and chests, bales and sacks. Some stockfish may be here. Higher, in the roof levels, lie the dry bulk goods that dislike damp. Rye, barley, oats, wheat, peas, beans, and other grain or pulses. The surviving layout makes that distinction useful. Grain belongs where it can remain dry, and the gable opening can be used to ventilate the loft. You do not need the language of modern humidity to understand the practical rule. If air in the roof feels wrong, you open what can safely be opened. If a sack has shifted against a damp patch, you move it. Your hands learn the warehouse by resistance. Rope, board, sackcloth, hoop. Winter stewardship is less a heroic profession than a long argument with moisture, usually conducted without raising your voice. The hoist also explains why you keep returning to the same clear patch of floor. A barrel lowered from above has to pass through successive openings before it reaches the working level. The technology saves carrying, but it rewards preparation. A blocked opening turns an efficient vertical store into several floors of hesitation. The seller asks for a different judgement. It is cooler and damper, which is not a defect if you put the right goods there. Cloth and furs can be stored below, along with beer and wine, large cakes of wax, and pitch. The same building therefore holds several small climates, each useful for a different part of a merchant's stock. You descend with a lamp and count by group rather than by beauty. Wax does not look especially dramatic in a cellar, but it belongs to a trade stretching eastward. Furs and leather can come from Russian markets. Herring comes south from Sweden. Stockfish and hides arrive from Norway. Grain may come west from Livonia. Lubeck itself moves grain, beer, hops, honey, rope, and Lüneburg salt into other routes. That list could become a geography lesson if you let it, so you do not. You put your fingers on the edge of a wax cake, check the mark beside it, and continue to the next stack. A warehouse turns geography into objects close enough to trip over. Your responsibility is not to admire the map. It is to know which piece of the map belongs to whom. The cellar can usually be reached directly from the street through a hatch, which gives heavy goods another practical route into the building. That access also explains why you treat the lower level as a working store rather than a hidden vault. Goods arrive, buyers may be shown stock there, and the floor remains part of daily commerce. Barrels make that question both easier and harder. Almost anything may travel in one. Wine, beer, salt, oil, butter, wax, grain, metals, and much else. A mark can tell you what a barrel contains. Other marks can identify where the barrel was made, who sent it, who owns it, or who is supposed to receive it. In Lubeck, coopers were required to mark barrels with the city's arms as a sign connected to origin and quality. You crouch beside a row and read wood the way another clerk reads a letter. Here is a merchant's house mark. There is a content sign. One hoop has darkened where wet boots brushed it yesterday. You wipe the stave and look again before entering anything in the account. The mark is not decoration. If a buyer later complains about quantity or quality, marks help establish which barrel is being discussed and whose responsibility follows it. A warehouse full of unmarked casks would not be romantic. It would be an argument with several hundred identical wooden witnesses, all refusing to give their names. You set the barrel back in line and make a small notation. The winter remains quiet because the marks keep talking. Pitch deserves one more glance because it links warehouse and harbour. The museum guide notes its use in sealing ships and barrels as well as for torches. A dark mass in the cellar, therefore, belongs to the same logistical world as the casks beside it. Materials for keeping cargo sound travel alongside the cargo itself. At the writing table, quiet becomes ink. By the 14th century, Lubeck merchants increasingly conducted business from home rather than personally following every consignment. More of them could read and write. Letters replaced some face-to-face dealings, and merchants sent their own people to work in other cities or accompany freight. That means a winter storehouse can contain goods whose owners are far away and whose next instructions may arrive on paper. You sharpen a quill and compare a line in the book with a mark on a bale. The work is not accounting in the modern sense of one universal system. Surviving medieval commercial practice is varied, and you should not imagine a standardized form waiting in every house. But written records, letters, and identifying marks are enough to make your ordinary burden clear. A merchant elsewhere cannot stand beside you and count his barrels. He has to trust the people, marks and records that connect him to them. You read the line twice because a repeated glance is cheaper than a disputed cargo. Outside, a cart rattles somewhere beyond the door. Inside, your world remains one mark, one line, and one decision at a time. The system of signs is useful precisely because one mark cannot answer every question. A city mark can speak to the barrel's making. A content sign can identify what is inside. A merchant mark can connect it to a sender, owner, or recipient. Winter checking means reading those layers without confusing them. Now the contradiction in the title begins to show itself. The winter warehouse is not full of things nobody wants. It is full because people want them, but not all of them can move immediately. The autumn market and sailing rhythms have delivered a season's traffic into rooms that must hold it until routes and orders make movement practical again. You climb back toward the grain. The Hanse is useful here, only if you picture it correctly. It is not a country with a capital issuing commands to its warehouses. It develops from associations of long-distance merchants and, over time, a changing network of towns joined by privileges, agreements, shared interests and habits of trade. Membership and influence vary. Lubeck becomes a leading city, but leadership is not the same thing as a central government. That looseness reaches all the way into your hands. These sacks are not state property. These barrels do not belong to an empire called the Hansa. They belong to merchant households and trading partners whose business is made easier by a network of rights and relationships. You tug one sack clear of the wall and check the board behind it. Grand networks are impressive. Dry boards are what keep them from smelling unfortunate by February. That written distance also changes who needs to be dependable. The merchant who stays in Lubeck can send another man with freight, or place a representative in a distant city. Authority travels through instructions, but the representative still has to judge real wood, real sacks, and real people. Your warehouse is one local end of that longer chain. Your first useful payoff comes before noon. A warehouse does not merely preserve commodities, it preserves identity. The mark on a barrel, the place of a sack, the note in a book, and the condition of a bale all keep an absent merchant connected to a physical object. Winter storage is therefore a form of trust made visible. You test that trust on a small problem. One barrel in the row carries a sender's mark you expected to find 2 positions farther along. The count is correct, the order is not. Nothing has been stolen and nothing has spoiled, but the misplaced cask matters because the next person may use position as part of the search. No crisis is needed. You simply roll it carefully back beside its fellows, recheck the mark, and correct the arrangement. This is the sort of victory a warehouse grants. The cask ends where the record says it should be, and nobody outside the room will ever know that it briefly considered a different career. You stand, flex your fingers, and look along the line. The first answer is already taking shape. What the warehouse holds through winter is not just goods, it holds the chain of responsibility that lets those goods become trade again. A first payoff does not finish the season, it gives you a rule for the rest of it. Condition and identity have to survive together. A perfectly sound cask under the wrong owner's account is not a success, and a perfectly recorded cask that leaks is not one either. Stewardship keeps both halves attached. The next one is not misplaced, it is simply damp at the base. You do not yet know whether the moisture came from the barrel, the floor, or a wet passage nearby, so you resist the satisfying mistake of deciding before looking. You move a lamp closer, inspect the hoops, and touch the board beneath it. The stave is not obviously leaking. The floor is dark in a narrow patch that continues past the cask. That matters because the cellar and lower spaces of this kind of house are naturally cooler and damper than the grain lofts above. Moisture is not evidence that a barrel has failed. It is evidence that you should check what sort of goods are standing where. You shift the cask enough to see the board, then compare the neighbouring one. The work is slow and untheatrical. A winter warehouse rewards the person who can tolerate not knowing for 3 minutes. One quiet aside before you lift the next tally. If these evenings genuinely do you good, you can like or subscribe and tell me where you are listening from and what hour it is there. Then you follow the damp trail toward the cellar access. The damp trail leads toward the cellar access rather than into the barrel. Someone has carried wet from the street farther than expected. You wipe the base, set a small wooden spacer under the vulnerable edge of a nearby bundle, and make sure nothing dry has been left where the wet patch can reach it. The exact household methods vary, and no surviving guide gives you a daily checklist. What the building evidence does tell you is more basic and more useful. Merchants deliberately separated goods by the conditions different floors offered. You turn that design into a routine. Grain remains high and ventilated. Cool cellar goods remain below. Barrels and bales occupy places where they can be moved and identified. The building itself is part of the inventory system. A rat scratches somewhere behind a board, or perhaps your mind supplies the sound because grain makes every small noise interesting. Black rats are archaeologically attested in medieval northern Europe, but this particular house leaves you no personal census. You inspect the sack corners anyway. A gnaw mark is a better discovery in January than a missing quantity in March. Nothing is damaged. You continue upward, carrying the lamp and the useful knowledge that damp has been found before it became somebody else's complaint. At the loft hatch, you let in a little winter air. The point is not to chill the grain for the pleasure of it. Dry bulk goods need a dry, ventilated place, and the upper floors of the merchant house are chosen for that reason. You look over the sacks, then at the loose grain stored in its proper section, and search for the changes that matter. Clumping, a darkened patch, a split seam, anything that would turn a quantity in the account into a smaller quantity in reality. The most dangerous defect today is almost embarrassingly small. A sack of rye has rubbed against a rough board until several threads have opened. A few kernels lie on the floor. The loss would fit in one hand, but the principle is larger. Grain from the eastern Baltic is a major part of northern trade. Lubeck merchants send grain north as well, including toward Norway, where imported grain is deeply important. You pull the sack away, collect what can reasonably be recovered, and have the seam secured before it widens. There is no heroic rescue music. There is a needle, coarse cloth, cold fingers, and a clerk who is suddenly very interested in 3 inches of thread. When the repair is done, the sack returns to the count without pretending that the morning was uneventful. The loosened seam sends you back to the book. The quantity lost is slight, but winter stewardship depends on refusing to let slight things become invisible. You note the repair in the house's working record in the cautious way the imagined role allows, without pretending that every Lubeck merchant used one identical ledger form. Then you compare the remaining sacks in that group. Here the warehouse begins to reveal another kind of volume. One sack is not impressive, 20 are. Several rooms of sacks, casks, bales, wax and stockfish become an obligation larger than any one object. Much of Hansa trade works through merchants who are linked across towns by privileges and agreements but still conduct business for particular households and partnerships. The network helps trade travel. It does not erase ownership. That is why your count cannot be merely total grain. You need to know which consignment is whose. A pile can look perfectly healthy and still be commercially wrong if 2 owners' goods have been confused. You run a finger down the next series of marks. For a moment the repetitions become soothing. Mark, count, condition, place. Then 2 sacks carry similar strokes, and you lean closer. Medieval house marks are wonderfully efficient until 2 of them decide to become cousins. You bring the disputed-looking sacks nearer the light rather than trusting memory. One mark has a short cross-stroke near its base, the other does not. That tiny difference separates 2 consignments. You check the corresponding entries, then move one sack back into the correct group. This is not evidence that a historical clerk in this exact house made this exact error. It is a plausible piece of staging built from a documented world of marked goods, written correspondence, absent merchants, and houses used as stores. The distinction matters because the surviving evidence gives you the system, not every Tuesday morning inside it. Then the modern aside ends and your hands return to the rope. A smaller barrel is ready to come down from the upper story. You make sure the path beneath the floor opening is clear, steady the load, and let the hoist do what the building was designed to let it do. A heavy object moving through a hole in a floor concentrates the mind with admirable efficiency. You watch the rope rather than the philosophy of commerce. When the barrel reaches the DLE, you check its mark again. It belongs to the group being prepared for a local buyer. Winter is not absolute stillness. Some goods can move within the town, even when long sea journeys wait. The local buyer arrives with cold on his coat and a practical interest in wax. Customers in a Lubeck merchant house need not stand in a formal shop. Business in such a merchant house can include taking customers down to the cellar and showing goods there. You lead him down, lamp first, toward the wax cakes. Wax is one of the goods that makes the Hansa map stretch east. Russian trade sends wax and furs westward through the network. In the cellar, the wax is less exotic than heavy. It has weight, a surface, a mark, and a place among other goods. No price is needed for this composite sale. Medieval prices vary by place, quality, year, unit, and surviving record, and a false exact figure would add nothing. Instead, the buyer looks at what is offered, the merchant or his representative handles the bargain, and your concern is the physical stock that changes status when a sale is agreed. One cake will leave the stack. That means the count changes, the space changes, and the record changes. The buyer may think he has come for wax. From your end of the transaction, he has come to disturb a beautifully stable rectangle, which is a more personal matter. After the buyer leaves, you close the gap in the wax stack rather than leaving an empty slot that will mislead the next count. This is one of those details no charter records, because nobody needs a charter to explain that missing objects alter a row. The evidence supports the goods, spaces, and record culture. The exact movement belongs to the plausible choreography of work. Your afternoon round reaches the barrels of salt. Lüneburg salt is one of Lubeck's important regional exports, carried north and east, and famously tied to the preserving of herring. From the 14th century, salt from the Baie de Bonneuf on the French Atlantic coast also presses into northern markets and competes with older sources, so even a substance as plain as salt carries a changing commercial history. You do not need to taste it to know which consignment you are checking. Marks and records do that job more safely. You examine the barrel head, then its hoops, then the floor around it. Salt has an almost comic ability to make itself seem both ordinary and indispensable. Nobody writes a love song to a storage barrel of it, but remove enough from the system and half the herring story becomes very short. The barrel is sound. You chalk the check in your working sequence and move on. By midwinter, repetition is part of the safeguard. You have already seen these rows, and that is precisely why you see change. A hoop that looked tight last week has shifted slightly. A bale that stood square now leans. A sack corner is lower than it was. Familiarity turns the warehouse into a set of small before and after pictures. You stop at a herring barrel. Herring is among the typical Hansa trade goods, and Sweden is one source named in the Lubeck merchant house material. The great Scanian fishery sends immense numbers of salted herring through Baltic trade in the later Middle Ages. Lubeck is one of its major exporters and import points. The barrel before you is not proof of a specific Scanian consignment, unless its marks establish that. You read them rather than letting the commodity's fame decide for you. That discipline is the difference between history and a convenient label. A faint line of dried salt shows near one stave. You touch it, then inspect the hoop. There is no fresh liquid. It may be an old trace from handling, but you set the cask aside for a closer look. The warehouse has finally produced something almost resembling suspense. It is a white line 3 fingers long. You call for a cooper's eye rather than deciding that several winters near barrels have quietly made you one. Coopers are essential to this trading world, because casks are one of its standard transport technologies. Lubeck's own guild regulations connect barrel marks with origin and quality. A damaged cask threatens not just its contents but the confidence attached to its mark. The inspection finds no active leak. The hoop can be tightened, and the cask can remain under observation. You place it where any new seepage will be visible instead of hiding it in the middle of a row. That choice resolves the immediate danger without inventing a catastrophe. A warehouse keeper's victory is often the prevention of a story dramatic enough to be remembered. The best barrel at the end of winter is the barrel about which nobody has a tale. You update the physical arrangement and the record together. The row now has one deliberate gap, and the watched cask has a deliberate place. The change is not loss, it is information. As you straighten, you can smell salt and wood more clearly than before. The cold seems to sharpen both. You carry the lamp to the next group, pleased that the near loss has become a maintenance job instead of a merchant's angry letter. The watched barrel remains dry the next morning. You turn that small success into a broader inspection, because one problem often improves attention elsewhere. The neighbouring casks carry a mixture of content signs and ownership marks. Some markings tell what is inside. Others identify maker, sender, owner, or recipient. Their meanings overlap without being interchangeable. You imagine what spring would look like if those distinctions had vanished. A shipmaster wants a consignment. The loading crew wants a clear instruction. A buyer in another town expects the right goods. A merchant who stayed home expects his representative to have kept the chain intact. One mistaken barrel can travel a long way before somebody discovers it. This is why winter storage is not passive. The goods may not move far, but information must stay attached to them every day. You check the barrel head with the short cross stroke, then the two beside it. All three belong together. The repaired cask stands apart under observation, still dry. There is a certain dignity in an object that survives scrutiny by doing absolutely nothing. For the moment, the barrel is performing magnificently. You leave it in peace and take the count toward the cloth and fur below, where the cellar's cool dampness calls for a different kind of attention. The furs are valuable enough to deserve careful handling, but value alone does not decide their place. The merchant house's lower storage is cool and damp, and its documented contents include cloth and furs as well as wax and drink. You inspect wrapping and separation, looking for any sign that the stored condition has changed. Trade in furs draws Lubeck east toward Russian markets and Novgorod. Yet even here, the Hansa network should not become a flag planted over every transaction. Merchants from many towns collaborate, compete, negotiate privileges, and sometimes quarrel. The network is strong because it coordinates interests, not because every participant stops having a hometown or private account. That is useful to remember while you compare two bales. Their outer wrappings look almost identical. Their marks do not. One belongs to a house that will send it west. The other is committed elsewhere. You separate them by a hand's width, enough that the next clerk does not treat proximity as ownership. The winter house contains several kinds of border. Floor from floor, dry goods from damp-tolerant goods. One merchant's stock from another's. Certainty from assumption. Your work is largely the unglamorous maintenance of borders. You lift the lamp and find the next one. Later, a letter arrives. The seal and wording belong to the world beyond the warehouse, where merchants increasingly direct business without traveling beside every cargo. You do not need to invent its exact sender. Its function is enough. A partner wants confirmation that a consignment is still present and ready for the next leg when movement resumes. You can answer because you have been counting. The barrels are where the marks say they are. The grain group is intact apart from the repaired sack and recorded small loss. The wax stack is reduced by the local sale. The herring cask under observation remains sound. Your reply is not a boast, it is a report. Written correspondence changes the texture of trust. An absent merchant can ask a question across distance, but the letter cannot look behind a barrel. Someone in the warehouse must do that. Paper extends the eye only as far as a reliable person is willing to walk. You set the quill down, sand or dry the writing according to the house's practice, and fold the work away. Outside, the street has gone blue with the short afternoon. The day's most important shipment is not leaving by ship at all. It is a few lines of reassurance travelling towards someone who cannot inspect his own property. The letter gives you a reason to test the entire consignment, not merely the convenient front row. You shift 2 casks, compare a third mark, and find the winter's more troublesome discrepancy. The written count says 12. The visible group holds 11. You count again because arithmetic is allowed one chance to embarrass you before you accuse the building. 11. The marks are clear. Nothing about the floor suggests a barrel has been moved recently. You take the book to the DL and trace the consignment backward through earlier notes. A local delivery removed 1 cask weeks ago, but that was entered against a different line. Another cask was moved for hoop tightening. That one returned. The missing item is not explained. The problem is serious in exactly the right historical way. Goods in a merchant house may belong to people far away. Marks and records exist because ownership and responsibility have to survive distance. A count that no longer matches is not a small aesthetic flaw. It can become a dispute. You resist the most tempting conclusion, theft, because there is no evidence for it. You also resist changing the number to make the page agree with the room, which would be a remarkable accounting innovation and a very short route to unemployment. Instead, you begin with the last known movement and follow the barrel. The trail starts with the hoist. Several days earlier, a group of casks was lowered so that a customer could inspect goods in the cellar and deal. One was then raised again after the passage became crowded. You ask the apprentice who helped, not because he is a suspect, but because his hands may remember what the page does not. He remembers a barrel with a shallow cut on one hoop. He does not remember the owner mark. That is useful, but not enough. You search the nearest storage group and find a hoop with the cut. The barrel beside it belongs to another merchant. The marked head is turned toward the wall. You roll it only far enough to read the wood. There is the missing mark. No one stole the cask. It was returned to the wrong group after being moved. The contents have not changed. The information around them has. That is the kind of error a winter warehouse is built to prevent, and a human warehouse can still produce. You compare the content sign and ownership mark twice, then have the barrel moved back to its proper row. The account count becomes 12 without changing a single numeral. The apprentice looks relieved. You are relieved too, though you preserve the expression of a person who had naturally expected the universe to become orderly as soon as he entered the room. You do not end the matter with relief. The mistake has shown where the system is weak. When goods move temporarily, position can become a false memory. Marks are the stronger evidence, so you change the house routine around the next movement. A shifted barrel gets a temporary note at the table until it returns to its marked group. This exact rule is your sensible staging, not a preserved Lubeck ordinance. What is documented is the world that makes such a rule plausible. Goods are marked for content, origin, ownership, sender, or recipient. Merchants rely increasingly on writing. Warehouses move loads internally by hoist. Responsibility stretches across distance. You carry the correction back into action. The missing cask is in place. The apprentice turns its marked head outward. The row becomes easier to read. The near loss has cost no cargo and little time. Yet it reveals the practical weakness more clearly than a dramatic accident would. Your enemy is not a band of thieves. It is the slow separation of an object from the information that tells people what it is. A warehouse full of trade can survive winter only if wood and writing remain on speaking terms. You close the book on the corrected page, then open it again. Trust is important. So is checking the page you just closed. The next round brings you back to grain, where a different kind of order matters. A barrel can keep its identity under a mark. Loose grain and sacks depend more heavily on grouping, condition, and measure. The upper floors are useful precisely because they can be kept dry and ventilated. You open the gable hatch briefly and watch the cold air alter the feel of the loft. No medieval clerk would describe this with a digital humidity reading. He would know by material signs whether grain clumps, whether sacks feel damp, whether boards carry moisture, whether stored goods smell wrong. The exact sensory checklist is partly reconstructed, so you keep it modest. You look, touch, and move what needs moving. One sack is now clear of the rough board that damaged its neighbour. Another has settled enough that its tie deserves checking. You deal with both before they become losses. Above the rooftops, winter has reduced the harbour's movement. That does not mean every northern ship everywhere obeys a formal closed-season decree. Weather, ice, routes, ports, and years differ. It means that sailing is strongly seasonal, and in a cold Baltic winter, a merchant may have to wait for practical navigation to return. Your grain does not care about the distinction. It only needs to be dry when the waiting ends. The waiting has its own calendar. Autumn herring has already passed through northern trade. Salt used in preservation has travelled the other direction. Grain waits for northern buyers. Wax and fur wait for western roads or ships. Letters move where people can. Local customers still come. A winter warehouse is not sealed outside time. It is the place where several calendars overlap. You stand in the DLE and hear the building answer those calendars with ordinary noises. Rope creaks. A bowl is set down near the cooking area. Someone crosses the floor above. Apprentices work and sleep close to the same stores they help move. This mixture of home and warehouse changes your idea of security. There is no modern loading bay isolated from domestic life. The merchant household occupies the same vertical structure as barrels and bales. Work, food, writing, sleep, storage, and trade share walls. That closeness creates its own discipline. A misplaced tool can block a path. A careless ember is a risk in any timber-filled commercial world, though the Lubeck house itself is brick. A wet cloak can carry street water where dry goods are waiting below a hatch. You hang yours where it belongs. Commerce at this scale can turn even taking off a coat into a contribution to logistics. One afternoon you sort a cluster of empty and part-used containers. The barrel itself is valuable infrastructure. Northern trade depends on coopers, staves, hoops, marks, and recognizable measures. At the Scanian herring fairs, which will become the next story, standardized Rostock barrels help turn fish into a product buyers can recognize across long distances. In Lubeck, barrel marks likewise tie container quality to place and responsibility. That future connection is already present in your storeroom. A cask is not neutral packaging. Its dimensions, workmanship, and marks can become part of the transaction. You examine an empty barrel before it is reassigned. The staves are sound. The hoops need no immediate work. An old content sign is not allowed to create confusion about the next use, so the house must make the new identity clear according to its practice. There is no universal relabeling ritual to perform. You simply refuse to let yesterday's meaning masquerade as tomorrow's. The empty cask weighs less than the full ones, but somehow demands nearly as much thought. This is perhaps the defining achievement of merchant administration. Even nothing, once placed inside a barrel, comes with paperwork. The light begins returning by degrees too small to trust at first. You notice it because your last inspection of the upper floor no longer requires the lamp quite as early. The warehouse remains winter-bound, but its purpose is shifting. Preservation slowly becomes preparation. You start identifying what is likely to move first. Goods meant for nearby customers stay accessible. Consignments awaiting ships must be grouped so they can reach the hoist without forcing half the building to migrate first. The merchant's letters matter more now because an instruction delayed in January can become a loading problem in spring. You do not yet drag everything toward the door. Premature readiness is another form of disorder. Instead, you make a sequence. Which marks, which destinations, which loads, which companions. This is where the winter's repetitive counts begin paying interest. You already know the watched herring cask is sound. You already know the repaired rye sack. You already know the barrel once misplaced after inspection. Each small event has become part of the mental map. The warehouse is not awakening from sleep. It has been awake all winter, just facing inward. You run the rope through your hands, check the floor opening, and imagine the first spring load descending through it. Before that first load can move, you make one more full cellar round. The wax stack is lower after local sales. Furs remain separated by mark. Beer and wine stand with the other cellar goods. Pitch waits where a ship-related material might become useful again. Above, grain remains in the dry lofts and barrels in their working rows. This vertical arrangement is the title answer in physical form. What did a Hanseatic merchant warehouse hold through winter? Not one famous commodity. It could hold a cross-section of northern trade, grain from the eastern Baltic, wax and furs from Russian connections, herring from Sweden and Scania, stockfish from Norway, Lubeck salt, cloth from western markets, drink, pitch, and many other goods according to the merchant and season. The exact contents of any one house varied. Your imagined inventory combines goods documented in Lubeck merchant house interpretation and wider Hansa trade, rather than claiming one excavated room contained every item at once. You pause beside the wax, then climb. The more important answer is what the house manages. It keeps differences intact, dry from damp, one owner from another, one destination from the next, a sound barrel from a suspect one. Winter turns storage into stewardship. That stewardship includes things that are not inside the building. Privileges make foreign trade possible. Town councils negotiate and defend rights. Merchant associations share information and interest. Contour abroad organize communities under their own rules. Ships, carriers, coopers, fish processors, fishermen, farmers, and buyers all stand somewhere beyond your door. The Hanse is the network among these relationships, not a sovereign layer that owns them. It can act powerfully, sometimes even collectively against rulers, but it never becomes a state with fixed borders, a permanent central government, or a tidy membership roll. You need only remember that, because the warehouse might otherwise look like a government depot. It is not. You are guarding particular people's goods within a commercial system larger than any one merchant. You pull a fur bale's covering straight and compare its mark to the next one. The political distinction immediately becomes practical. If the network is not the owner, then ownership must remain legible at the level of the bale. The great history of the Hanse often appears in treaties, wars, diets, and privileges. Your winter version appears in a much less martial form. Do not put her A's wax under her B's mark. Civilization has many scales. Some fit comfortably on a cellar shelf. A second letter confirms an intended spring consignment. The merchant wants grain and selected barrels made ready for a northern route. You read the instruction, then walk it physically. First the grain group, then the barrels, then the hoist, then the clear space in the DL where loads can wait without blocking household work. The path is possible, but one stack of local sale goods sits too near the hoist opening. You shift it now rather than on loading morning. This is preparation by subtraction. You remove obstacles, uncertainties, and stale assumptions. The goods themselves remain where conditions suit them until movement is justified. At the watched herring cask, there is still no new seepage. The tightened hoop has done its job. At the rye sack, the repaired seam holds. At the once missing barrel, the ownership mark faces outward in the correct row. 3 tiny problems have become 3 proofs that the winter routine worked. You add none of them to a heroic ledger. A merchant who receives sound goods in spring may never know which small defects were noticed in January. That anonymity is part of the keeper's success. You begin to suspect that the best winter record is a boring one. Fortunately, you have been training for it with unusual dedication. The harbour still cannot promise you a departure date. Cold water, wind, ice in harsher spells, and the practical rhythms of medieval navigation make winter uncertain, especially on the Baltic routes. The evidence does not support one universal day on which the Hanse declares the sea open. Spring movement resumes port by port and voyage by voyage. So you prepare without pretending to command the weather. You check the ropes and hooks used in the internal hoist. The house's hoisting arrangement uses a wheel and rope running through the floors, with a separate line and hook to secure a load. The mechanics are simple enough to understand and important enough not to improvise under a full barrel. An apprentice clears the lower opening. You lower an empty cask as a test and watch it descend cleanly. The operation is not silent. Wood complains, rope rubs, boots shift, but the line stays controlled and the cask reaches the DLA without touching the edge of the floor. You set it aside and look upward through the stacked levels of the house. For months, the vertical route has helped you inspect and rearrange goods. Soon it will become the first part of a journey back toward the water. The next clear morning brings a customer for cloth, and the warehouse reminds you that spring preparation does not cancel winter business. You take the buyer down to the cellar stores, show the appropriate bale, and leave the bargain to the merchant or authorized representative. Your job begins again once the chosen quantity is identified. The Western cloth trade is one of the Hansa network's great connections, with textiles from Flanders and England moving east and northern and eastern commodities moving west. Yet the object in front of you is not an abstraction called international exchange. It is folded material that must leave without stealing the identity of the bale beside it. You separate the sold portion, update the working count, and close the store. The buyer's departure gives you a useful thought. A warehouse does not merely wait for ships. It meters goods back into motion whenever a valid claim arrives. A local sale today, a cart tomorrow, a ship in spring. This makes the titles Through Winter less like burial and more like custody. The house holds trade in a reversible pause. You return to the DL, where the test cask still stands. It has moved one floor and no farther, a very small rehearsal for a very long commercial world. By now you know what the warehouse held, but one question remains. What exactly has your labour preserved? The answer becomes visible when you compare the first winter count to the goods now staged for spring. The grain still exists as merchantable grain because it stayed dry and ventilated. The herring barrel remains sound because a suspicious trace was checked rather than ignored. The rye sack lost only a handful before its seam was repaired. The displaced cask is reunited with its owner mark and account. Wax sold locally is gone for the right reason, not because account failed. None of this depends on a fantasy of perfect medieval control. Errors happen. Containers fail. Weather changes. Records can be incomplete. What matters is the system of repeated correction. You stand beside the spring group and read the marks from left to right. This is the full payoff. The warehouse has held a winter's web of trade in trust, barrel by barrel and sack by sack, until people can safely ask the routes to carry it again. It has preserved not just cargo, but the agreements attached to cargo. The ice outside, where it forms, will eventually loosen. Your real work has been making sure identity does not loosen first. The final days of your winter watch become gentler because most questions are now answered. You no longer wonder whether the suspect cask leaks. You know it does not. You no longer search for the 12th barrel. It stands in the correct row. You no longer need to discover how the building sorts its conditions. Your feet know which staircase leads from damp cellar to dry loft. You make the round anyway. That repetition is not padding in the keeper's life. It is the mechanism. A warehouse cannot be checked once in November and trusted until April. Material condition changes slowly, and slow change is exactly what repeated inspection can catch. At the loft, you open the gable hatch for air. In the DLE, you clear the hoist path. In the cellar, you count wax and fur groups. By the herring cask, you find dry wood. At the table, you compare one last letter with its marked consignment. The house is ready without looking transformed. This is another feature of careful work. Success often leaves the room looking much as it did before. You put the book down and listen to activity in the street. Somewhere toward the Trave, more voices carry than they did a month ago. Months before those winter barrels line a Lubeck storehouse, you stand on the Scanian coast in the hard-working end of summer. The peninsula is under Danish rule, and the herring fair has begun. Scania and Falsterbo sit beside a seasonal commercial world where fishermen, traders, carriers, food sellers, officials, and workers gather because the fish have come. You are attached to a Lubeck merchant group, close enough to the processing huts to see what turns a catch into cargo. Your ordinary goal is narrower than the scale around you. Secure barrels of herring that meet the expected quality and can be identified as they travel. The fair may run from August into autumn, ending in October or November depending on the convention and period described. The merchant settlements called vitis begin as seasonal colonies and grow more permanent in the later Middle Ages. They are organized by hometown, with their own representatives and rules. But before any legal structure matters, a boat noses toward shore. You watch baskets come up from the beach. Fresh herring has a short, useful life. Salt, Labour, barrels, and inspection must turn that hurry into something that can cross Europe. The shore itself is only the first station. Behind it, every town group has to turn a burst of catch into a commercial flow before the season passes. Your merchant therefore watches not just price, but processing capacity. Workers available, empty barrels ready, salt close at hand, and space where approved casks can wait. The sale begins on the beach because that is where merchants are permitted to meet the fishermen for the transaction. Once the fish change hands, specialized carriers move them inland toward the merchant settlements and the processing huts. The fair divides work with impressive clarity because speed matters. You follow your merchant's lot away from the water. The fish do not yet resemble the neat casks you inspected in winter. They are a wet, shining mass that has to pass through several hands before a buyer in Lubeck, Flanders, England, or farther away can treat them as a stable commodity. Behind the beach, the vitties form streets of temporary or increasingly permanent structures belonging to different towns. Merchants live under the law of their hometowns and are represented by a vogt. The arrangement helps many urban groups occupy the same crowded seasonal ground without pretending they are one unified city. Your concern today is not a boundary dispute. It is whether the fish reach the gutting room promptly. A carrier sets the load down. The next workers take over. At a fair famous for trade across half a continent, the first serious question is still wonderfully immediate. Who has the clean barrel, and where is the salt? The fair's spatial order becomes easier to understand from the carrier's route. Fish moves from a common natural resource at the water into town-based commercial zones on land. Each transfer narrows responsibility. By the time the catch reaches a merchant hut, it is no longer simply part of the day's haul. It belongs to a transaction. Inside the processing hut, the division of labor becomes visible. Women called gutting women prepare the herring. Other female specialists, laying women, pack the fish into barrels. A late medieval description of the Scanian trade gives about 830 to 840 herring for a standardized Rostock barrel, mixed with Lubeck salt and water. That number should not tempt you into imagining every fish identical or every medieval cask in Europe governed by one measure. The point is that this market uses recognized standards, and the workers are responsible for a product whose size and quality can be checked. You watch layers form. Fish, salt, arrangement, more fish. The barrel is a vessel and a measuring device at once. A merchant buying many casks needs each one to mean roughly what the trade expects it to mean. The laying woman's work is therefore not casual packing. The quality of the herring and salt matters, and an inspector will judge the finished cask. You keep your merchant's mark ready for the barrel that passes. The fish are disappearing from view, but their commercial identity is becoming more precise with every layer. 1,000 miles of trade begins with someone noticing whether the next herring is the right size. The number is useful because it shows what standardization means in practice. Not a vague, large barrel, but a recognized commercial unit built around expected capacity and quality. You keep the figure as an approximate historical guide, rather than pretending every surviving cask would contain an identical count. Salt is the quiet partner in the operation. Lubeck's inland salt works are tied closely to Lubeck's commercial rise, and salt moves north toward the herring fisheries. The same merchant world that carries fish away has first carried preservative toward the coast. You see why the trade works as a circuit rather than a one-way extraction. A town does not merely arrive, buy fish and vanish. Barrels, salt, cloth, grain, metal goods, and other merchandise come into the fair. Herring goes out. Traders also exchange goods among themselves, so the Scanian market is much more than a fish landing. For your barrel, however, the salt has one job. It has to help preserve a catch that otherwise deteriorates quickly. The worker mixes it with water around the packed herring to create the brine described in the historical account. You do not calculate a modern salinity. No source here gives you one. And the medieval quality system did not depend on your invented percentage. It depended on recognized materials, practiced labor, and inspection. The barrel fills to its expected form. The lid is prepared. Your merchant's interest sharpens, because once the fish are hidden, the marks on the outside will have to carry much of the story. Salt supply also connects two different kinds of season. Inland extraction can continue on its own rhythm, while the fishery suddenly demands large quantities during a short coastal rush. Merchants make the two calendars meet by transporting preservative before or during the fair, so the workers are not left waiting beside a perishable catch. The racker arrives after the laying women have done their part. This inspector is not merely checking whether a lid exists. Hanseatic herring controllers examine the finished product and brand an accepted barrel with a special circular sign. The mark conveys information about production place and quality. Combined with the producing merchant's brand, it also helps establish responsibility if a buyer later exercises a right of recourse. You stand close enough to see the logic. A barrel that passes inspection can travel away from the workers who packed it without losing every link back to them. Standard and mark turn local skill into distant trust. The inspector checks the quality and size of the herring, the salt, and the finished product. You do not need to supply gestures that no surviving account preserves. Then the approved cask receives its sign. That little circle has more travel ahead of it than many people on the beach. It may be read in another port by someone who never sees Scania. You add the merchant's identifying mark. The barrel is now not simply full, it is legible. The fish have acquired paperwork without the inconvenience of learning to write. The brand does not make the fish better after the fact. It records that people with recognized responsibility judged the product before it left. That is why the controller matters to buyers elsewhere. The mark carries a decision forward, allowing a distant complaint to point back toward a place, a standard, and a merchant. Not every cask deserves the mark. The existence of inspection only matters if rejection is possible, and quality systems have teeth because buyers can complain or refuse what does not conform. The surviving rules emphasize responsibility and recourse without giving you a neat percentage of failures, so you leave that number alone. Your next barrel draws a longer look from the controller. One layer was packed from fish that vary more in size than the standard expects. The cask is held back. The practical friction is immediate. Fish are perishable. Labor is busy. Salt and barrel capacity have already been spent. Yet pushing an uncertain cask into trade would damage the very reputation that makes the mark useful. The laying workers reopen the problem. Suitable fish are sorted for the right use, and the barrel is repacked according to the accepted practice. You wait with your merchant's mark unused. This is the herring season's small near loss, and it resolves through ordinary control rather than spectacle. A weak barrel is caught before it becomes a buyer's complaint in another city. When inspection comes again, the cask passes. The circle goes onto the wood only after the product earns it. Standards are fussy because distance is unforgiving. Outside the hut, the entire coast seems organized around the same clock. The fair draws fishermen from the water, merchants from towns around the Baltic and beyond, and workers into the settlements behind the beach. During the herring season, the Scania Peninsula becomes one of medieval northern Europe's major trading centers, with the fair running from August into November. The seasonal concentration changes more than the beach. Contemporary evidence shows the fishing season drawing people across the Danish islands and Scania toward the market, strongly enough to disrupt ordinary councils, school activity, and church inspection. That is a striking claim, and it tells you how completely a commodity can reorganize human time. You do not need to repeat every example. You can feel it in your own day. Meals happen around deliveries. Sleep shortens when catches are heavy. Empty barrels become urgent objects. Salt becomes a supply problem. A delayed carrier matters. Your merchant's business calendar is therefore not divided into equal months. It bulges around herring. You step aside for another load coming from the beach. The crowd makes the path narrow. A fish small enough to fit in your hand has somehow arranged the afternoon of half a coastline. The crowd is not one undifferentiated Hansa mass. Merchants organize by hometown in separate vites, each with its own representative. Over time, those spaces become more sharply defined and, at times, disputed. Lubeck, Danzig, Rostock, Stralsund, Copenhagen, and other communities can be neighbors without becoming one political body. That spatial order matters to your barrels. You need to know which settlement, which merchant, which inspector, and which mark stand behind a cask. The Hansa's network helps towns cooperate and defend privileges, but rivalry remains real. Lubeck and Danzig even become leading competitors in Scania herring export. You carry the approved cask toward your group's storage area. Its path crosses a boundary that is mundane to you and politically meaningful to town representatives. Keep the load on the correct side, and nobody has to discuss jurisdiction. Records preserve quarrels over crowded space and boundaries because limited ground creates friction. You use that evidence lightly. Today, your problem is simply that another merchant has left a handcart where your barrel needs to pass. The cart moves, so do you. International commercial tension sometimes resolves itself with diplomacy. Sometimes it resolves because someone notices they are blocking the lane. The barrel joins others with the same merchant mark. Now scale enters the story. Medieval herring export figures are difficult because the surviving customs evidence is thin. Estimates must therefore be treated as estimates, not precise annual truth. Even so, the recorded numbers show extraordinary movement. For example, Lubeck merchants declared more than 70,000 Rostock barrels of Scanian herring in each of several years around 1398 to 1400, with year-to-year variation. A separate estimate places minimum medieval Danish herring exports at around 100,000 Rostock barrels annually, while acknowledging the small documentary sample. You do not turn those numbers into a wall of statistics. You look at the row in front of you and understand what scale means materially. Each barrel requires staves, hoops, salt, fish, labor, inspection, marks, space, transport, and a buyer. Multiply that not by 10 but by tens of thousands, and a fishery becomes a timber problem, a salt problem, a labor problem, a shipping problem, and a calendar problem all at once. You put your hand on one lid. Large economies are made from objects that still have to be rolled one at a time. Barrel supply is therefore part of the herring season before the fish even appear. Standardized Rostock casks give the market a known container, and Lubeck's merchant world likewise treats barrels as marked products whose making can be regulated. The cooper is not a background craftsman, he is part of the commercial infrastructure. You inspect an empty cask waiting for the next catch. A loose hoop now is easier to repair than a loose hoop after brine and fish have filled every gap with consequence. The cooper makes the adjustment. You return the cask to the ready group. Nothing in this action requires you to claim all Scanian barrels were manufactured in Rostock itself. A Rostock barrel functions as a standardized measure and recognized type in this trade. Production and actual cask histories can be more complicated. The distinction is exactly the sort your warehouse mind appreciates. A standard name tells you how people understand capacity. An ownership mark tells you whose barrel it is. A production mark may tell you something else again. By late afternoon, you have become surrounded by circles, cuts, signs, and hoops. The herring market is very good at reminding you that a container is never merely the empty space around a commodity. The next morning begins with poorer news from the water. The catch is lighter. Medieval records show real fluctuations in the Scanian herring fishery, including years of scarcity, while the later decline resists any single simple explanation. The useful limit is simple. Abundance could be great, but it was never guaranteed. For your merchant, a light catch changes the day's rhythm. Workers wait longer between loads. Empty barrels remain empty. Buyers pay closer attention to what reaches the beach. A sudden price spike would be false precision. so the day's consequence stays with less fish to process. Prices require evidence by year, quality, currency, and measure. Instead, you show the consequence you can defend. Less fish means less material to process, and the fixed apparatus of labour, salt, barrels, and merchant space has to wait. When a boat finally lands a worthwhile catch, the line of carriers tightens again. The laying women return to their rapid sequence. The wracker's inspection matters no less because the day has been slow. Scarcity does not lower the standard. If anything, it makes the temptation to accept mediocre product more obvious. Your next cask passes without correction. You mark it and send it to the row, relieved to have something solid to do. By the end of that day, the fair's scale looks less like abundance and more like coordination. The fishermen cannot preserve every catch alone. The merchants cannot create fish. The laying women need barrels and salt. The wrackers need recognized rules and authority. Carriers connect beach to processing huts. Town representatives keep order inside crowded settlements. Shipmasters eventually take the preserved product away. A commodity organizes a town because each group starts arranging time around the groups beside it. You follow one finished barrel from hut to temporary storage and then toward the loading point. The cask carries a place quality circle and a merchant brand. Those marks make the next handoff possible without every worker accompanying it. The barrel is heavy enough that nobody confuses trust with weightlessness. Men at the cart strain it into position. The wheels take the load. You walk beside it, checking the mark each time it changes hands. That is the deeper payoff. Herring is not important merely because medieval Europeans eat a great deal of preserved fish. It becomes economically powerful because a standardized, inspectable, preservable product can be coordinated across seasons and distances. The fishery turns a migrating shoal into appointments kept by towns. You spend the following morning where salt enters the merchant settlement. The material is so common to the process that it is easy to let it disappear into the background. Yet every preserved barrel depends on having enough of the right quality at the right moment. Lüneburg salt has long travelled through Lubeck toward the Baltic fisheries, while Atlantic Bay salt becomes increasingly important in northern markets from the 14th century. That change matters because the herring trade is not locked into one eternal supply route. Merchants respond to price, access, quality, and availability. A famous connection such as Lubeck and Lüneburg can remain important while alternatives grow. You are not asked to choose the winning salt of the century. Your merchant needs a usable supply today. A delivery arrives, is identified, and goes where the laying work can reach it. Empty casks stand nearby. The arrangement looks mundane until you imagine either pile missing. Fish without barrels is a problem. Barrels without salt are another. Salt without fish is merely inventory waiting for better company. The fair's economy works because those separate streams meet in time. You return to the processing hut as another catch arrives, and the workers begin again before the last cart has fully cleared the lane. The rhythm becomes familiar enough that you can notice departures from it. Fish come from the beach. Gutting women prepare them. Laying women pack selected herring with salt and water. A wracker checks quality. Marks establish place, product, and merchant responsibility. The approved cask moves into a group for shipment. What changes is the volume. On a strong day, the sequence barely pauses. On a weak day, workers wait. The whole market breathes with the catch. You follow one barrel to the edge of the Lubeck Viti and look back across the settlement. These town-based settlements become more spatially defined over the later Middle Ages. Limited land produces arguments about boundaries, buildings, signs, and access to the sea. The Vogt represents his community and helps maintain law and order according to hometown rules. That legal machinery is important, but you keep your camera on the cask. Its route crosses no disputed line today. A cart receives it cleanly. The ordinary goal has not changed. Send out only herring that can survive the journey and still be recognized when it arrives. A medieval fair may contain international politics, but your particular afternoon is improved considerably by a wheel that does not come off. Toward evening, a buyer from another region examines the approved stock. He cannot reopen every barrel and personally interview every worker who touched it. The point of the quality sign is to make that unnecessary. The circle tells him where and under what recognized system the herring was prepared. The merchant's mark ties responsibility to a producer or seller. This does not eliminate fraud or dispute. No commercial mark can make people perfect. What it does is create a basis for recourse. A complaint can point back toward an accountable product rather than dissolve into some fish from somewhere. You stand beside the row while the buyer chooses. One rejected cask from earlier has now been properly repacked and approved. It looks no different at a glance from its neighbours, which is exactly why the mark matters. The buyer selects several. Their transfer is entered into the merchant's working record. You have watched trust move from human skill into a physical sign and then into a transaction. That is one reason the herring trade can scale beyond face-to-face acquaintance. A recognized barrel, a quality control system, merchant reputation, and town privilege allow people who do not know one another well to trade a perishable food across long distances. The barrel becomes a small portable argument that the work was done properly. The season advances, mornings sharpen, daylight contracts, and the fair begins to lean toward its end. Historical descriptions give different festival endpoints within the broad August to November span. Because customs and periods vary, so you do not pretend one date closes every hut. What matters is the seasonal shape. An intense autumn market eventually empties. You now spend more time on outgoing groups. Barrels are counted by merchant and destination. Their marks kept visible where possible. The Lubeck merchant's share can be substantial. In one documented year, 1494, Lubeck accounted for 32.5% of Scanian herring exports, while Danzig accounted for 22.3%. That figure belongs to that year, not to every century. You do not need the percentage to feel the departure. Carts keep arriving at the loading places. Crews find space for casks. Merchant representatives compare counts before cargo passes from land to ship. One barrel is held because its mark has become hard to read under grime. You clean the head and confirm it before it moves. At the beginning of the season, the problem was preserving fish quickly. Near the end, the problem is preserving information while everything starts moving at once. A ship taking Lubeck cargo cannot swallow the season in one mouthful. Barrels arrive in batches. Weight has to be distributed, access maintained, and the master has his own concerns about seaworthiness and cargo. No surviving loading plan tells you exactly where every cask sits, so you keep the arrangement practical rather than precise. Instead, you stay with what your merchant can verify. Each accepted cask goes aboard under the correct count and mark. The barrel you have followed reaches the quay. It has passed from fishermen to carriers, from gutting and laying workers to inspector, from merchant storage to cart, and now toward a vessel. Every handoff could have detached it from its origin. The marks keep the consignment together even when the barrels move apart. You watch the cask disappear into the hold. This is not yet the warehouse winter. It still has water to cross. In Lubeck it may be sold quickly, sent onward, or stored according to merchant plans. Many routes are possible, so you do not assign this particular cask a buyer you cannot know. The important thing is that the preservation process has converted days of biological urgency into months of commercial possibility. Fresh herring demanded haste. Salted, inspected herring can wait for a market. That extra time is one of the quiet technologies on which the whole trade depends. On the beach, the final weeks leave traces even as the crowd thins. Huts have been worked hard, empty salt containers and barrel stocks are reduced. Merchants who spent the season negotiating, counting and watching quality begin thinking about home routes. Fishermen follow the changing catch. Town officials settle what they can before communities disperse. You make one last circuit of the Lubeck area and return to the reason a single commodity could organize so much human activity. Herring is abundant in the right seasons, but fragile when fresh. Preservation demands salt and containers. Large markets demand standards. Distance demands marks, trust, and transport. The fish arrive on a biological calendar that people cannot simply reschedule. That combination forces labor, craft, commerce, and law to meet on the same stretch of coast at the same time. A town's year bends around it because waiting until next Tuesday is not always an option. You pass a processing hut that is quiet for the first time in days. The silence feels earned rather than empty. Story 1 showed barrels holding winter trade still. This story has shown how one famous class of those barrels came into being, through a chain of people whose work begins while the fish are still wet from the sound. The fair's wider consequences travel with the merchants. Salt demand ties inland production to maritime preservation. Cooperage demand turns forests and workshops into part of the fish trade. Shipping demand links Scanian beaches to urban ports. Food supply connects the barrels to consumers far from any herring shoal. Even religious eating patterns increase demand for preserved fish across Christian Europe. But you keep that broad context brief because the more revealing evidence is already in your hands. Approved barrels from Scania appear across distant markets, and records show enormous volumes moving through Lubeck and other ports. You stand at the edge of the departing settlement, while a last cart creaks toward the loading place. The commodity has organized labor without becoming a person. People still make every decision. That distinction matters because seasonal pressure is not the same thing as helplessness. Herring did not command anyone. Fishermen, merchants, workers, officials, coopers, carriers, and buyers built institutions around a recurring natural opportunity. The result can feel almost mechanical, only after thousands of human choices have made it repeatable. You check the count on the final outgoing group. It agrees. For once, a large historical system gives you the rare pleasure of a small number coming out exactly right. As the Scanian season closes, you return in imagination to the winter barrel in Lubeck. Its circular quality sign is not a magical passport, but it is a memory of the beach pressed into wood. The merchant mark beside it is another memory. Together they tell a later keeper that this cask has a history before it entered the row. That is the earned payoff of the herring story. A standardized barrel lets a town's frantic autumn become another town's reliable winter stock. The market calendar, preservation work, inspection, and marks all stretch the useful life of the catch far beyond the moment it leaves the net. You do not need to know which particular cask from the fair reaches your Lubeck house. The evidence supports the route at scale, not one invented object's biography. So the barrel from this story can remain representative rather than secretly documented. The last boats of the season leave the Scanian shore behind. The market contracts. Streets that were crowded regain space. The work does not vanish. It has been transferred into cargo. Farther along the network, someone will have to receive, store, sell, or forward it. And in another northern port, a different kind of winter community is already settling into close quarters. That next community lives at Bryggen in Bryggen, where German merchants established themselves from the 13th century, and a formal Hanseatic contour develops around the middle of the 14th. Unlike the temporary rush of the Scanian fair, Bryggen's trading post becomes a durable residential and commercial quarter. You arrive there not with a herring barrel, but with the idea that trade requires people to stay put as well as travel. The wooden rows of Bryggen stretch back from the waterfront. Bryggen's preserved functional pattern places offices and dwellings toward the front, warehouses in the middle, assembly rooms and kitchens farther back, with fire-resistant stone cellars at the rear. German merchants take up winter residence in individual wooden houses, and storerooms may be used individually or collectively. For the next story, you will be one of the younger men in that working community, old enough to carry responsibility, and new enough that other people still know more rules than you do. The ordinary problem changes. A barrel no longer needs to survive your inspection. You need to survive several months of other merchants' habits without turning shared commerce into a household quarrel. In Bryggen, winter residence changes the meaning of a trading post. You wake in a narrow wooden building at Bryggen, with work stored close by, and other men moving through the same long row of rooms. The German merchants who established themselves here did not merely visit for an afternoon's bargain. Through the winter, German merchants remain in individual wooden houses here, with storerooms used by single merchants or shared collectively. You are a young adult apprentice from a merchant family, attached to one of the households in the contour community. The role is historically grounded, even though your individual name and mourning are invented. Your ordinary goal is to become useful enough that the older men can trust you with goods, messages, and counts. The physical quarter keeps reminding you that private life and commercial life are difficult to separate. Offices and dwellings face the waterfront. Warehouses occupy the middle parts of the long properties. Assembly rooms, kitchen facilities, and stone cellars sit farther back. You pull on your outer layer and follow an older clerk toward the store. Winter has reduced the number of easy departures. It has not reduced the number of people whose habits you must learn. A household is manageable. A commercial community of households sharing rules, yards, passages, and weather is an education conducted at close range. The arrangement makes winter residence commercial rather than merely domestic. A man can sleep, eat, receive instructions, and reach stored goods without leaving the long working property. Shared life is built into the plan. So is the possibility of friction, because doors, passages, kitchens, stores, and meeting rooms all have to serve more than one person's preference. Your first task is grain. Bryggen's Hansa trade is strongly shaped by an exchange between imported grain from the Baltic region and stockfish from northern Norway. German merchants gain privileges connected to grain imports, and the contour becomes deeply involved in supplying a city and region for which imported grain matters. You help move sacks toward the proper store, checking the merchant mark before each one joins the group. The building evidence at Bryggen does not give you the same vertical storage map as the Lubeck dealing house, so you do not copy that arrangement here. Different place, different architecture. What does carry over is the discipline of ownership. Storerooms may be used individually or collectively. A shared storage space therefore makes marks and records especially valuable, because a wall does not always separate one merchant's goods from another's. You read the mark, say the name to the older clerk, and wait for his nod. By the fifth sack, the procedure feels repetitive. By the sixth, you understand that repetition is the point. The joke available to the apprentice is mild and local. There are many ways to become memorable at a contour, and putting the wrong man's grain in the wrong store is among the less ambitious ones. You choose obscurity and carry the sack correctly. Imported grain is not an ornamental side trade here. The Bryggen connection becomes politically and economically important, partly because Norwegian consumers rely heavily on grain brought from the Baltic world. That dependence gives a sack in your arms consequences beyond its weight, while the stockfish moving outward helps pay for what comes in. The stockfish store has a different feel. Dried cod from northern Norway is the commodity most strongly associated with Bryggen's Hanseatic trade, and stockfish gives the contour much of its commercial purpose. The fish arrives dry rather than salted in barrels, and merchants exchange it into a trading system that carries it south, while grain moves north. You follow the older clerk through the count. Bundles and grades of fish require expertise you have not yet earned. You are allowed to carry and identify consignments, but judgment about quality stays with men who know the product better. That limitation is useful. Apprenticeship does not instantly grant professional knowledge. It is a hierarchy of trust. Young apprentices at Bryggen could also be treated roughly. You do not turn that into a comic rite or invent humiliations. It is enough to understand that training could be hard, and that younger men occupied a subordinate place in a community where discipline mattered. You lift another bundle, place it where directed, and return for the next. Outside, the harbour air reaches the front of the row. Inside, the merchant's winter problem remains close to the one in Lubeck. Keep goods identifiable, usable, and ready for the transaction that will eventually move them. Your personal problem is simpler. Listen before pretending you know. The dried fish's great advantage is already present before you touch it. Preservation has happened at the producing end, allowing the commodity to travel without the brine barrels of the Scania herring trade. The two fish stories therefore solve distance differently. One uses drying, the other salting, and both require merchants to preserve identity after preservation has done its physical work. By midday, you have moved from storage work to the writing side of the contour. A large trading community needs rules because its members are not one household and do not always share the same immediate interest. The major contour function as self-governing, guild-like bodies with their own treasurer, laws, seal, and leadership under aldermen. That structure does not turn Bryggen into Hanseatic sovereign territory. The merchants operate within a Norwegian city and through negotiated privileges. Those special privileges create a powerful trading enclave, not an independent country. You carry a message to a senior merchant who is involved in the community's administration. The paper concerns an ordinary allocation of storage and account that needs confirmation. There is no constitutional speech. Rules become real because somebody uses them to settle small matters before they become large ones. You wait while the men compare the note with their records. For a young apprentice, this is perhaps the least glamorous discovery of winter. Institutions spend much of their time preventing avoidable confusion. The seal, the treasurer, the alderman, and the regulations exist at one scale. At yours, the result is that you are told which storeroom receives 3 sacks tomorrow morning. You remember the room. Self-government does not mean that every merchant makes his own rule in isolation. It means the organized community has recognized officers and procedures for common business. A treasurer handles collective money, the seal authenticates community acts, and aldermen provide leadership. Those tools let separate merchant interests act together when they need to. The route to that room takes you along one of Bryggen's characteristic long plots or guard structures. Bryggen contains roughly 30 long rows of houses on rectangular properties, with individual wooden rooms and buildings serving combinations of storage, living, and sleeping functions. You move through spaces where sound carries more easily than privacy. Boots on boards, a door opening, a cough, men speaking low German, someone calling for a missing tool. The common language helps merchants from different towns work together, but shared language does not erase hometown loyalties or personality. Winter concentrates those personalities. A merchant from one house wants the passage kept clear because his stockfish will be moved later. Another wants a crate left near the wall until a clerk returns. You have no authority to solve their preference. You move the crate only after the senior man responsible for the space decides. The friction is deliberately ordinary. Histories of trading leagues can leap quickly to blockades and treaties. A winter community must also decide where a crate can sit without obstructing a corridor. You carry the decision into action, then continue toward the rear of the property where the stone storerooms stand. The contour survives partly because people keep sharing space after the novelty has disappeared. The stone cellars at the back explain one of the quarter's practical fears without requiring a dramatic fire. Small fire-resistant storerooms at the rear protect special goods and valuables, while the rest of Bryggen remains predominantly wooden. Architecture records what people considered worth defending. You deliver a small locked container to a senior clerk at one of these stores. Its contents remain unspecified. The surviving description tells you the purpose of the room, not which merchant put what in this particular chest. That restraint leaves the more interesting action intact. 2 men verify the container and the receiving record before the door closes. Collective storage requires a chain of acknowledgement. The lesson resembles Lubeck, but feels different here. In a private merchant house, the keeper answers within one household structure. In a contour, Many merchant houses operate inside a wider community whose own rules and officers help coordinate them. You stand outside the stone room for a moment, waiting for the clerk to finish. The winter rain has darkened the boards in the yard. Water runs where people have walked all day. The valuable container is dry behind stone. Nothing about the scene needs danger to make the building legible. The safest room often tells you what a community has already worried about. Evening does not end the community, it changes rooms. Bryggen's surviving pattern includes assembly rooms called shot steward, as well as kitchen facilities toward the rear. These spaces matter because wooden merchant quarters have to support meals and meetings as well as trade. You join older men for food after the day's store work. The conversation touches on shipments, debts, messages from home, and the behavior expected from younger members. No verbatim rulebook is needed. What is securely supported is that the contour has its own laws and leadership, and that apprentices live within a disciplined merchant community. You listen more than you speak. One merchant has spent years in Bryggen. Another arrived recently from a Hanse town. Their commercial interests overlap, but are not identical. The contour gives them a framework for living and trading together. It does not make them brothers of one opinion. The meal ends. Duties are assigned for the next morning. You learn where you are expected before first light. This is a quieter kind of governance than a town council meeting. But it may be the form an apprentice knows best. A senior voice, a shared room, a practical instruction, and the knowledge that somebody will notice whether you obey it. You leave with the next day's task already attached to you. Morning brings a stock fish count with a senior merchant whose handwriting you have learnt to read. You match each bundle group to the working record and discover one line that could refer to either of two marks. Rather than guess, you bring the ambiguity back to him. He studies it, recognizes his own abbreviated note, and clarifies the entry. The event is small, but it exposes why community rules cannot replace household competence. A contour can maintain a seal, officers, and regulations. It cannot make every mark obvious or every clerk's pen elegant. Trade still depends on individuals noticing when certainty has run out. You return to the store and attach the clarified identity to the proper group. Modern evidence can tell us that merchants used these buildings, that stock fish and grain dominated important parts of Bryggen trade, that the Germans wintered here, and that the contour governed itself. It cannot recover every disputed line in every merchant's book. Your morning remains plausible staging inside those limits. The next sentence belongs back to your hands. You retie the bundle tag, check the adjacent mark, and move down the row. Winter life at the contour is becoming less exotic. That is the point. Institutions become durable when their members can spend long months doing ordinary things under them. A delivery of grain arrives under rain. The sacks come from a commercial chain reaching toward Baltic suppliers, though you cannot assign each one an origin without a record. Norway's dependence on imported grain gives this cargo a social weight beyond the merchant's account. You help receive it. The older clerk checks the marks. Another man records the quantity. You carry sacks under cover. Nobody announces that the Hanse is feeding Norway. The historical fact exists in aggregate. The human scene is a line of men keeping flour to be out of the weather. One sack slips against your shoulder. You recover before it falls and set it down where instructed. The senior clerk checks the seam, then nods you back to the next load. There is no late joke. By now the action itself is enough. Grain imports help explain why German merchants gained such leverage in Bryggen. Their trade links a northern fish-producing region to cereal markets around the Baltic. Privileges, dependency, competition, and politics all grow around that exchange. You experience it as weight. When the final sack is inside, the doorway clears. Rain continues beyond the threshold, but the count is complete. The older clerk closes the record and sends you to the stockfish store, where outgoing wealth is waiting in a form dry enough to handle with both hands. The stockfish count teaches the exchange from the other direction. Northern Norwegian cod, dried for preservation. becomes a sought-after export across Europe. Bryggen is the place where merchants assemble, grade, buy, and forward much of it. The contour's long presence is inseparable from that trade. You carry one bundle to a sorting place and watch an experienced merchant judge what you cannot yet judge. He considers quality before assigning it to a commercial group. You do not supply invented grade names or prices. The absence of false precision matters. Medieval commodity systems can be highly exact without matching the categories a modern writer would like to invent for them. You help rebuild the stack after inspection. Each bundle returns to a group whose identity is recorded. The winter community now appears as two linked inventories. Grain comes toward Bryggen. Stockfish gathers for routes away from it. Merchants live between those movements, exchanging letters, credit, goods, and trust. For an apprentice, the movement is slower. You learn a mark today, a quality distinction next month, a trading relationship over years. You place the final bundle and step back. The store does not care how quickly you become interesting. It rewards accuracy. Winter, with its long residence and repeated tasks, gives accuracy time to become habit. There are disagreements, but they need not become scenes of shouting. One merchant wants earlier access to a shared storeroom. Another claims his own consignment has priority. The matter is carried to the senior people responsible for the community, rather than settled by whoever can stand longest in the doorway. The contour's self-governing structure is what makes this ordinary resolution plausible. Officers and regulations exist to handle common business among merchants who otherwise represent separate houses and hometowns. You wait with two assistants while the decision is made. The first group will move its goods in the morning. The second will use the space afterward. You are told to keep the central passage empty for both. The result satisfies nobody completely, which may be one sign that shared space has been allocated fairly enough to work. You do not make that a joke. By this point, the inconvenience is familiar enough that you give it little attention. The next morning, you arrive before either group. You move one stray bench, check the floor, and make the passage ready. The first merchants come, their goods pass through. Hours later, the second group does the same. A written or spoken decision has become two successful movements and an empty corridor. That is governance at warehouse scale. Days begin resembling one another in the useful way winter days can. You wake in the same row, cross the same boards, answer to the same senior men, and learn the same stores more deeply. Direct address still keeps you near the work, but the number of new names and rules begins to fall. One morning you are trusted to carry a short account between two merchant houses without an older apprentice beside you. The task is small. That is why it matters. You know which passage to take. You know which door. You recognize the merchant mark over the relevant store. You hand the note to the right clerk and wait for his reply. Nothing goes wrong. Apprenticeship pays off through an expanding circle of tasks that no longer require rescue. The roughness associated with Bryggen training should not obscure that economic communities also depend on teaching younger members how to work inside them. You return with the reply folded as given. At the front of Bryggen, the harbour lies under winter weather. At the rear, the stone cellars hold their quiet stores. Between them, rows of living and working rooms keep the community functioning. You deliver the note and receive only a nod. A month earlier, you would have wanted more recognition. Now the nod is enough. It means the message arrived. A letter from Lubeck reaches the household and reminds you that the contour is neither isolated nor self-sufficient. Instructions, news, accounts, and commercial expectations travel between Bryggen and merchant towns to the south. Ships cannot provide instant communication, and winter weather stretches time, but the relationship persists through paper and representatives. The senior merchant reads the letter, then asks you to fetch the record for a grain consignment received earlier in the season. You know where it is. The request closes a small circle. In your first days, every object required direction. Now a line of writing sends you directly to the correct book and then to the correct stored group. You compare the mark with the entry while the merchant stands beside you. The quantity agrees. The useful change is local rather than grand. A community built to handle long-distance trade has made you competent at finding one local answer. The merchant dictates a brief response to his clerk. The corresponding goods remain in place. Winter residence is doing what seasonal movement cannot. It provides time for relationships, training, records, and shared rules to settle into routine. You close the store after the check. Beyond the door, rain has softened to mist, and the waterfront sounds farther away than it did at the start of the season. The question that has followed you through these rooms is nearly answered. How can merchants from many houses live and work together for months without one central state commanding them? At Bryggen, part of the answer is spatial and institutional at once. The guard structure organizes offices, dwellings, warehouses, common rooms, kitchens, and protected stores along repeated plots. The contour governs its merchant community with its own offices, laws, seal, and common procedures. Individual houses retain their own goods and interests. Younger members work under older ones. Shared rooms force daily cooperation that written privileges alone could never produce. You feel the answer while preparing a collective storeroom for inspection. One merchant's stock occupies the left group, another's occupies the rear. The third has a locked container in the protected stone section. The marks keep them distinct. The room keeps them together. The arrangement is neither pure private household nor centralized depot. It is a negotiated community of merchants. You check the passage, then step aside for the senior men. They enter, compare the groups, and leave with no dispute. That uneventful result is earned. Months of rules, records, habits, and hierarchy have made an ordinary shared room workable. The Contour's great achievement tonight is not conquest. It is that everyone can still find his own goods. As winter begins to loosen, tasks shift from residence toward movement. The merchants do not abandon the community structure. They use it to prepare goods and instructions for the next phase of trade. Stockfish groups are identified for departure. Grain accounts are settled or carried forward. Messages begin asking more insistently about ships and timing. You help clear a working space near the front of the property. The same waterfront that has been a view for months will soon become a route. Preparation happens through familiar actions. A bundle is checked, a door is freed, a list is compared with marks, a damaged tie is replaced. You have already learnt why this matters from Lubeck. Bryggen adds another dimension. The goods are not the only things kept through winter. The merchant community itself persists, with apprentices, senior merchants, common rules, and shared spaces holding commercial relationships in place while voyages slow. You carry one marked bundle to the forward store and return for another. The older clerk no longer walks beside you. At the rear, the stone storeroom door closes. In the middle, stockfish stacks remain ordered. At the front, more men are looking toward the harbour. Winter residence is becoming spring readiness, one small transfer at a time. Your last apprentice task before spring preparation takes over is to deliver a confirmed count to the household's senior merchant. You have checked it against the goods. The clerk has checked your work. The number is not exciting, and that is why you can trust it. He reads the line, asks one question about the merchant mark, and accepts your answer. The payoff is personal and institutional together. The contour works because people can be trained into its routines. Merchants can rely on common structures without surrendering private interests, and shared winter residence turns repeated coordination into habit. The community is close, hierarchical, sometimes rough, and full of potential friction, but it has rules and spaces designed to keep trade functioning. You leave the account on the table. Nothing announces that you have become experienced. Tomorrow someone will correct you again. Apprenticeship is not completed by one accurate count. Still, when the senior merchant asks where the associated stockfish group stands, you can tell him without looking. He sends a man to inspect it, and the man finds it there. The long months at Bryggen have given you the answer. Many houses can share a contour, because coordination is built into rooms, offices, marks, and daily authority. The harbour is beginning to call those routines outward again. The bridge away from Bryggen is simple. You carry the last message toward the front, and stop where the wooden rows meet the waterfront. The season has not changed in a single dramatic instant. There is simply more preparation than there was before. Men speak about departures with less speculation. Stores are being opened more often. Goods once arranged for keeping are being arranged for handling. A ship at the quay receives attention along its sides and rig. You do not follow that vessel south. The final story returns to Lubeck, to the warehouse keeper, whose winter rows were already being staged near the hoist. The two places are connected by the same commercial network, but remain themselves. Bryggen's winter community has its stockfish, grain, wooden rows, and common rules. Lubeck's merchant house has its dry lofts, damp cellar, rope hoist, marked barrels, and spring orders. The action continues without needing a fresh problem. You leave the apprentice at Bryggen with a message delivered and account accepted. No unresolved quarrel follows him. No new name needs remembering. Water moves against the quay. A bundle waits behind him. Far to the south, another clerk is about to open a warehouse door and find that the air no longer feels quite like winter. One final morning at Bryggen, you pass the same places in reverse order. From the rear stone store you walk through the working middle of the guard, toward the offices and dwellings by the water. The route has become so familiar that it no longer needs explanation. A senior clerk gives you a short list of goods to remain in place, and goods likely to move when a suitable ship is ready. You compare the marks and return the list. Nothing else needs resolving. The shared storeroom is ordered. The apprentice's count has been accepted. The merchant houses still have separate interests, but the contours, rules, and officers give them a way to manage common life. Winter has not made them one household. It has taught them how to remain neighbours in business. You leave the list at the table and carry no new question away. At the waterfront, the season is changing in practical signs rather than poetry. More cargo stands near doors. Men spend longer around vessels. Conversations turn from keeping goods to moving them. The next action belongs in Lubeck. There, a warehouse door opens onto a street that has held the same cold for months, and the clerk from the first story steps outside to see whether the routes he prepared for are becoming routes again. Back in Lubeck, spring begins with uncertainty rather than a date. Medieval northern navigation follows seasons, weather, and local conditions, and Baltic ice can halt movement in harder winters. But the southern Baltic does not freeze to one identical calendar every year. In this particular cold season, thin ice and frozen margins have lingered along quieter water, while exposed channels open and close with weather. You are the same warehouse clerk, now carrying a shipping instruction instead of a winter inspection list. The first thing you do is not roll barrels toward the quay. You walk to the river and look. Water is moving more freely. Small pieces of ice drift apart near the edge. Crews are working around vessels rather than merely checking lines in bad weather. A ship intended for an eastern route is not ready to load today, but it may be ready soon enough that your warehouse must begin staging cargo. You return uphill with a practical answer. Spring has not opened the sea like a door. It has narrowed the waiting. At the merchant house, the marked grain group stands where you prepared it. The watched herring cask is still dry. You clear the space beneath the internal hoist and begin turning months of stewardship back into movement. What matters is the difference between a formal season and practical readiness. No bell across the Hansa announces that winter navigation has ended everywhere. The clerk responds to local evidence. Water opening, ships being attended, messages becoming more definite, and merchants willing to commit cargo. Spring arrives commercially through decisions before it arrives as a date. The first load down is a sack, not a barrel. Grain has waited in the drier upper part of the house, where ventilation helped keep bulk goods in suitable condition. Now the same hoist that let you inspect and rearrange stores becomes the beginning of their outward route. You fasten the load, make sure the opening below is clear, and lower it through the floor. An apprentice receives the sack in the DL. He reads the merchant mark aloud. You compare it with the shipping list. Only then does it join the group near the door. The sequence repeats with another sack. Nothing about loading needs to become faster than winter inspection. A mistake made now can travel farther before it is discovered. The very moment that makes merchants eager to move is the moment when the clerk benefits from remaining slow. The spring list groups cargo by destination and ownership. The house's marks let you distinguish one merchant's grain from another's, even when the sacks look alike. By midday, a small stack has reached the ground floor. The loft is not empty, the ship is not loaded, the harbour is not fully busy, yet the warehouse has changed direction. Goods that spent winter moving only enough to stay safe are now moving with a destination attached. Each lowered sack also reverses a storage choice made months earlier. The loft kept dry bulk goods away from the cellar's cooler dampness. Now condition becomes proof of successful placement. A sack that can be accepted for shipment without salvage or dispute is the practical return on all those quiet inspections. Barrels come next. The herring cask, whose hoop was tightened in winter, has earned one final inspection before it leaves the row. The wood is dry at the old trace. The hoops sit firm. Its marks remain readable. You compare those marks to the line on the shipping instruction. The cask belongs with a group bound toward a western buyer, not with the eastbound grain. That distinction sounds obvious because the record has preserved it. Months earlier, when another barrel returned to the wrong row, you learnt how quickly position can lie. You lower this one only after the destination group is ready. The internal hoist takes the weight. Rope runs, the barrel descends, and men below steady it onto the DL. The circular quality sign from the herring trade and the merchant's mark are still on the head. They have survived handling, storage, and winter. You do not claim that every mark remains perfectly legible forever. The cask you have followed has been kept readable because its marks were checked whenever it moved. At ground level, it joins the correct outbound group. The near loss from winter has reached its quiet conclusion. No brine has escaped, no complaint has been created. The barrel is ready to become cargo again. The barrel's marks have also survived as working information. The quality circle points back toward the herring trade, while the merchant mark carries the private commercial identity needed now. Spring does not erase the stages that came before. It simply asks whether the evidence attached to the cask is still usable at the next handoff. Outside the warehouse, other trades are preparing too. Carts move more frequently toward the waterfront. Porters carry loads. Coopers remain useful because a cask that has waited through winter may still need attention before shipping. Pitch, stored in merchant cellars and used for sealing ships and barrels, belongs to the practical world of maintenance surrounding renewed voyages. You do not follow a shipwright into technical work that lies outside your clerk's task. You stay with what your clerk can see: men bringing rope, checking accessible gear, moving supplies, and making vessels ready to receive cargo. A ship at the quay sits lower only after the first goods go aboard. Before yours do, the merchant's representative confirms the destination and the expected group. You hand over the list and point to the corresponding marks. The winter routine has made this conversation short. One group of grain, several marked barrels, a bale of cloth, a separate consignment of wax. Not every documented Hansa commodity must travel on this vessel, and you do not turn the hold into a museum display. The cargo is particular because trade is particular. The cart is ordered. You watch the first sack leave the doorway and realize that the warehouse is beginning to empty in exactly the way you spent winter preventing it from emptying by accident. The harbour preparation you can see remains deliberately general. Medieval ships varied, voyages differed, and a modern checklist would be false precision. The safe claim is the visible one. A vessel has to be made ready to receive goods, and materials such as rope and pitch belong to the practical work around hull, rig, container and cargo. The cart route from merchant house to harbour is short compared with the voyages ahead, but it still creates another handoff. A porter checks the load, the cart driver needs the correct key, the ship's people need to know which merchant's goods they are receiving. The marks and written list accompany the process without becoming spoken citations. You walk with the first group. Lubeck's position as a commercial hub has long depended on linking Baltic and Western trade. Goods from the east and north pass through, and goods from the west and the Lubeck region move the other way. The merchant house is one node in that exchange, not a central warehouse for the entire Hansa. At the quay, you stop the cart beside the correct vessel. A crewman compares the first mark. The sack is accepted. Then another. The physical labour belongs to the men lifting and shifting weight, but the clerk's contribution is the continuity of identity. The same mark read in the loft is read at the ship. You remain close until the group is accounted for. Water knocks softly against the quay. A loose piece of shore ice turns once in the current and drifts past without significance. The season does not need a trumpet. A sack leaves a cart and enters a ship. That is enough to prove movement has resumed. The warehouse is quieter after the first cart leaves, though only by a few sacks. You return for the next group and find the empty floor space where they had stood. The absence is legitimate, recorded, and linked to a vessel. That distinction has been the whole winter's work. You lower 2 barrels of salt destined for another transaction. Salt is heavy, ordinary, and central to northern preservation trades. Some of it may return toward fishing markets. Some may be sold closer to home. You follow only the shipment your list supports. At the DL, each barrel's content sign is checked before the cart is loaded. A city or maker mark can speak to barrel origin and quality. An ownership mark speaks to a different responsibility. You do not let one sign substitute for another. The second cart leaves. This time you stay in the warehouse and prepare the wax. Large wax cakes have occupied the cool cellar among furs, drink and pitch. Their journey upward is the reverse of winter storage. They come from below into the working floor, are counted, and join a marked outbound group. The house is slowly giving the map back to the world. First grain from above, then cellar goods from below. The Dearly becomes the crossing point where stored directions turn into actual departures. News from the harbour changes by the hour. One vessel will leave later than hoped, because the master is waiting on another consignment. Another has a favourable opportunity, and loads steadily. Medieval departure schedules are not timetables in the modern sense, so your merchant keeps several plans flexible. You respond by refusing to stage goods too early. The wax remains inside until its vessel is certain. The grain already delivered stays under the shipmaster's responsibility according to the handoff. A group of fur bales remains in the cellar because its buyer has not confirmed movement. This restraint is part of reopening too. Spring does not mean empty every storehouse at once. It means decisions can become physical again when weather, vessel, buyer and cargo align. You read a new note at the table and change one sequence. Cloth will move before wax. The cloth bale comes from the cellar group and reaches the DL. Its mark is checked. A porter arrives. The route clears. The action is almost the same as the morning's, but the house now feels less full around it. Each correct departure creates space and a new responsibility outside the walls. You mark the transfer and look toward the door, where the next cart waits in brighter afternoon light. At the quay, a vessel receiving mixed cargo shows why merchants value compact, durable containers. Barrels can be rolled and handled. Sacks fit around other loads. Bales can be stacked. The hold is not an abstract volume. It is a problem of weight, access, and safe stowage managed by the ship's people. You do not direct that work. Your authority ends at the commercial handoff. The cloth is checked against the cargo group, accepted, and carried aboard. A clerk associated with the vessel records receipt according to the practice of the voyage. You keep your own confirmation. Around you, the harbour is now audibly busier than it was in winter. More carts arrive, more ropes move, voices carry between quay and deck. None of those sounds needs to be made loud in the narration. They simply replace the long indoor stillness of the first story. You watch the ship settle slightly under additional weight. A merchant nearby waits for his turn. Another argues quietly over access to a cart. A porter steps around a coil of rope. Human action has returned to the waterfront in layers. The important consequence for your winter work is simple. Cargo that survived winter is not merely still good. It is accepted as cargo. The months of storage have successfully reached the next handoff. The next morning, the air is milder and the remaining ice at the sheltered edge has broken into smaller pieces. You do not make it a symbol larger than the evidence can bear. Southern Baltic winters vary, and ice is only one of the conditions that can slow movement. In this chosen winter, its retreat gives the harbour a visible measure of change. Your first task is the wax group. The cakes come up from the cellar, each associated with the correct merchant record. Wax from eastern trade connections can travel westward through Lubeck. The merchant's instruction gives a route but no buyer worth inventing, so you keep the destination no more precise than the order requires. You check the group, authorize the cart, and walk it to the quay. The vessel is ready. One cake is transferred, then another. The receiving man confirms the count. You have repeated this kind of handoff enough that the scene can grow quieter. No new system needs explanation. The same habits carry the work. Mark, count, condition, destination, transfer. At the edge of the quay, water moves where ice rested earlier. The wax disappears below deck. You return to the warehouse for the furs. The fur bales have waited in the cool cellar through the same months as the wax. Now their coverings are inspected before movement. You find no new damage. The marks remain visible. A buyer's representative arrives to confirm the group. You lead him to the cellar, as customers and representatives could be shown goods in the merchant house, rather than entering a separate modern shop. He examines what he is entitled to examine. The merchant completes the commercial decision. You then arrange the physical release. The bales come up one by one. You do not repeat the entire history of Eastern fur trade. That fact has already done its work. Now consequence is enough. Goods stored under suitable conditions are able to leave when called for. The first bale crosses the DL. The second follows. A third remains because it belongs to another house. You compare the marks before the door closes. Outside, the buyer's cart takes the selected bales away from the harbour route, rather than toward a ship. Spring reopening does not mean every good goes to sea. Land movement, local sales, and sea voyages overlap. The warehouse loses another small portion of its winter weight. You record the transfer and leave the untouched bale exactly where its own owner expects it to remain. By afternoon, the grain loft shows real gaps. Some sacks have gone north with one shipment. Others remain committed to later buyers. You walk the floor and find that the spaces once hidden between sacks now receive light from the gable opening. There is less to inspect, but the remaining goods are not less important. You check one repaired sack from winter. Its seam still holds. It has not yet been called for. That small fact prevents the ending from becoming too neat. Reopening is a process. Some cargo leaves with the first ships. Some waits for the next. A warehouse can be both emptied and still responsible. You move the repaired sack into the group designated for a later voyage, and make sure its mark faces outward. Below, another cart arrives. The harbour's renewed motion sends work back into the house in pulses. A letter, a request, a count, a lowering, a handoff, then a pause. You no longer need to ask whether the warehouse will fulfill its winter purpose. It already has. The remaining question is simply how the last scene of that stewardship looks when enough goods have moved to make the answer visible. You close the loft hatch partway and descend toward the DLE, where the watched herring barrel's old space now stands empty. At the quay, the herring vessel is preparing to depart. The approved cask you followed through winter is somewhere in its cargo group, no longer visually special among the others. That loss of narrative privilege is appropriate. A successful barrel joins trade and stops needing your attention. The master is not waiting for you to make a speech. He waits for the last commercial confirmations, the practical readiness of ship and crew, and conditions suitable for departure. You stand beside the merchant's representative while the final count is compared. It agrees. This handoff completes the winter warehouse's promise from another angle. Winter stewardship mattered because spring could use it. A sound barrel, a dry sack, a legible mark, and an accurate account are valuable only when they allow goods to move without reopening every old uncertainty. The vessel eases against its lines. You step back from the quay. There is no need to claim that all Baltic sailing begins today, or that one departing ship marks an official Hansa season. Other ports and routes have their own weather and timing. This is one merchant voyage in one spring. That modest scale is enough. A line is cast off. Men shift on deck. The ship begins to move away from the quay, with cargo that spent winter under someone else's care. You watch only until the vessel has room to turn. Then the warehouse calls you back, because another consignment is waiting, and history rarely allows one beautiful departure to cancel the afternoon's work. The next group is grain. You return through streets where carts now pass often enough that people make space without looking surprised. At the merchant house, the apprentice has already lowered 2 sacks. He gives you the marks. You compare them to the next order. Both are correct. You send him for the third. This repetition closes another thread. Earlier in winter, temporary movement put a barrel in the wrong row. The house responded by tying movement more closely to written and visible identification. Now spring-loading tests that have it repeatedly, and the errors do not recur in the scenes you follow. That is not proof that the system never fails. It is payoff for the particular problem that filled the first winter morning. The third sack reaches the dial. Its mark matches. You add it to the cart. Nothing extra is needed with the success. The work is satisfying because it works. The work is satisfying because it works. Outside, the wheels begin toward the quay. You stand in the doorway for a moment, looking from the emptier house to the busier street, then follow at an unhurried pace. Several departures later, the warehouse has changed acoustically. Footsteps carry farther across the loft. The cellar has more open wall. The DLA holds temporary outbound groups for hours instead of days. You make a final seasonal inventory rather than a final inventory forever. Grain remaining, identified. Wax remaining, identified. Fur bales, identified. Salt barrels, identified. A few casks await local buyers. Stockfish and other goods occupy their proper groups according to the merchant's business. The exact mix is not the same as at the start, because winter included legitimate sales and spring departures. That difference is what a functioning warehouse should show. You compare the count with the book. One line requires a correction, not because goods are missing, but because a cart delivered its consignment yesterday, and the transfer note has not yet been carried into the summary. You trace the supporting note, confirm the handoff, and update the working account. The correction is routine. This last discrepancy is resolved by paperwork rather than searching a room. It shows the same principle in reverse. Goods can move correctly while a record briefly lags behind. You bring the two back together. Outside, another ship is taking cargo, and the warehouse ledger once again describes what the building actually holds. The harbour now holds the work that the warehouse held all winter. You walk there after the day's accounts close and find a waterfront transformed by accumulated small actions. Carts wait in different places. Porters carry sacks. Barrels roll under controlled hands. Ship crews receive cargo. Merchants and clerks compare marks. Ropes tighten and slacken. Vessels sit at different stages of readiness. Some will leave soon. Others will wait. You recognize your own warehouse's goods only when a familiar mark passes. That is enough. The Hansa network never needed every town to become one government in order to create this movement. Privileges, merchant associations, town interests, contour, recognized practices, and repeated relationships made large-scale trade possible, while ownership remained particular. Lubeck's harbour demonstrates the network in the least abstract way available. Different people's cargo arrives from different houses and leaves on different routes. You do not add another list of places. The names have already done their work. A barrel with a Lubeck mark passes toward a ship. A sack follows. The men carrying them disappear behind another load. The scene is busier than the winter warehouse, but not more urgent. Spring movement is the consequence you have been preparing for, not a new mystery. You turn back toward the merchant house as evening begins to lower the light. There is one last warehouse action before the day settles. You climb to the upper floor where the grain was stored and open the gable hatch. The air is milder. Below, the hoist rope hangs ready for tomorrow. In the cellar, the remaining wax and furs are counted. On the DL, no outbound group blocks the passage. The repaired sack is now gone on a later cart. The watched herring cask left on the first vessel. The misplaced barrel was corrected months ago and has since moved under the proper mark. Threads that once required attention have become completed transfers. You look across the remaining stock. The winter warehouse did not preserve a frozen collection. It preserved options. Because goods stayed sound and identifiable, merchants could sell them locally, send them by cart, load them onto ships, or continue holding them for later orders. Storage kept choices open until movement was possible. That is the answer you carry from the house. You close the hatch enough for the evening and descend. The door opens onto a street still active with harbour traffic. A cart passes toward the trave with 2 barrels aboard. You let it go ahead of you. The warehouse behind has done what winter asked. The harbour ahead is doing what spring allows. The marked barrel can rest now without another inspection. Its hoops are only hoops again, its head only wood with familiar lines across it. The lantern stands nearby, giving enough light for the book to remain closed. The warehouse is quieter around the spaces where cargo used to stand. Rope hangs through the opening above. The floor beneath it is clear. Nothing needs to be lowered before the next moment arrives. Beyond the door, the harbour keeps its settled movement. A cart passes, then is gone. Water touches the quay. A ship holds its place while another shape moves farther out. The images no longer need explanation. Barrel, rope, lantern, book, water. They have already carried their meanings through the evening. The lantern flame stays small. The barrel does not move. The harbour does. For a while, the 3 can remain together exactly like that. One thing stored, one light kept, one stretch of water open beyond the door. No count is waiting to be corrected. No mark needs to be read again. The book stays shut on the table, and the room holds only the familiar work after the work is done. The lantern is carried a little farther into the warehouse, past the clear place on the deal and beneath the rope. Light reaches the boards, then leaves them behind as it moves. A row of barrels remains along the wall. Some spaces between them are empty now. The gaps are familiar too. They belong to cargo already handed onward. The lantern pauses beside one barrel. The old marks are visible without being read. The hoop catches a narrow line of light. Wood, iron, and shadow settle back into the shapes they have had all evening. Outside, the harbour continues at a distance. The water is no longer a problem to solve. It simply moves along the quay. Ropes lie where working hands left them. A vessel shifts gently against its place. The lantern returns toward the table. Nothing new enters the room. The closed book remains beside it. The warehouse door is still within sight. Beyond it, the harbour is still there. The familiar objects grow simpler when no decision is attached to them. A barrel can be a barrel. A rope can hang. A page can stay closed. The light remains low and steady. At the doorway, the warehouse and harbour fit into one quiet view. Behind, the lantern rests near the closed account. Above, the rope disappears into the darker floors. Ahead, water lies beside the quay and carries the last of the day's movement. A barrel stands near the wall with its marked head turned outward. No one needs the mark now. It has already been checked, moved, checked again, and left where it belongs. The harbour answers with only familiar motions. Water along timber, a line easing, then still. A hull changing its angle by a small amount and settling back. The room does not become empty, it becomes sufficient. The lantern makes a soft edge of light on the table. The book keeps all its pages together. The rope remains ready without being used. Nothing asks for attention. The barrel stays in the same place as the light lowers around it. Beyond the door, the water keeps moving in the same direction it has moved through the last scenes. Warehouse, lantern, barrel, harbour. The evening has already taught each image. Now they can remain without explanation. The light is lower again. Only the nearest barrel is clear now, with the curve of one hoop and the worn face of the wood. Farther back, the warehouse becomes rows and spaces rather than separate goods. The book is closed. The rope hangs still. At the harbour, movement has thinned to the same familiar water against the quay. No departure needs to be followed. No returning cart needs account. The last work visible from the door belongs to its own quiet distance. The lantern does not reach that far. It reaches the edge of the table, the first boards of the floor, and the barrel nearest the wall. Those are enough. A little light remains on the mark without asking anyone to read it. A little movement remains on the water without asking anyone to name a destination. The warehouse has become the same simple set of shapes it was before every detail received a purpose. Timber, rope, barrel, page, flame, water, they stay where the winter work has left them. The lantern holds for another moment, and the harbour beyond the door keeps moving softly in the dark. The last image is the lantern beside the closed book. A barrel stands within the edge of its light. The rope is higher up, almost lost in shadow. Through the doorway, only a narrow piece of harbour remains, dark water touching the quay and then drawing away. Nothing is added. The mark on the barrel stays unread. The page stays closed. The rope stays still. The water keeps its small motion. The lantern makes one familiar circle on the wood. The same kind of light that followed counts. Damp boards, repaired seams, and spring handoffs earlier in the night. Now there is no task attached to it. The warehouse can remain behind the light. The harbour can remain beyond it. Barrel, lantern, water. The images do not have to go anywhere else. The lantern, barrel, and dark water remain where the night's work has left them.